The following interview is a presentation of Ofiɔ Media. It first aired on KXLU Los Angeles. My guest today is Uljas Pulkkis, a Finnish composer who I don't even really know how to introduce because his body of work is so diverse, so broad and so incredible. It includes, instrumental works from very, intimate chamber pieces to large ensemble pieces that really capture, to speak very colloquially, kind of the full spectrum of emotion, I feel like. And I'm just so honored, Uljas, that you're here to talk to me today, so that I can ask you about your music, about a new piece of software that I understand you've actually developed, that I was lucky enough to get to poke around at a little bit. It's extremely cool, and I'm excited to hear your perspective on it, and also your work as an opera composer. We'll get to all of that, but starting with just some general questions about music. It seems to me that your approach as a composer is very practical, in the sense that you focus your creative energy to such a great extent on trying to control how the music will interact with the listener's ear, or maybe I could even say with the listener's brain. And we'll get into psychoacoustics later. I'll definitely want to ask you about that as well. One area in which it seems to me that this is the case is the way that you use key changes. You have this way of just getting the absolute maximum effect out of a key change. Sometimes these changes really sneak up on the listener, or at least have snuck up on me. Other times you can anticipate them coming, but somehow you end up really feeling the force of the change when the moment arrives. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about your orientation as a composer towards the listener, and then, starting with the example, if you feel that's an appropriate place to start, of key changes.
Yes, absolutely. First, about my background a little bit, because I'm actually not from a musical family at all. My parents were both engineers. And for example, my father did his life career on quantum cryptography. And my childhood education was centered more on mathematics than music. And I actually began fascinated by music because of how it links to mathematical formulas, especially when it comes to timbres. And the emotional impact of music is, of course, beyond any algorithm, but well-sounding and resonant sound can be calculated. And especially the orchestral timbres interest me because you have a limited set of material, namely the orchestral instruments, but still the set of possible timbres is unlimited, at least for a single composer. And the limited material is very important because it boosts, for me, creativity. For example, in the case of unlimited material, like in electronic music, when timbre can be composed from the scratch, the task is a lot harder, and often you end up mimicking some already existing timbre. So timbres have been an important part of my composition practice from my first publicly performed chamber orchestra piece, which is called Octet. And in that piece, I used some very experimental playing techniques also, such as reversed mouthpieces and playing piano with a spoon, etc. But later on, I found out that so-called extended techniques are not what musicians are trained to do. It can be interesting, for example, for a pianist to play with a spoon in one or two pieces, but in the end, not every piece can be like that. Highly trained piano player is specialized in phrasing and producing a beautiful tone and building musical climaxes, and asking such a professional to play with a spoon would be the same as asking a nuclear physicist to swipe the floor. So my practical approach to timbres comes from my respect for musicians. I actually love to hear instruments played beautifully, even though there is not anything revolutionary or groundbreaking thinking in that. So the issue is, my issue is roughly the same with other art forms as well. For example, you do not need to invent new words for writing a good novel. And when it comes to key changes, I don't actually think music through key changes, but rather through harmonic rhythm. The density of musical information can be effectively controlled by harmonic rhythm, and the distance of harmonic change is proportional to the effect it makes. But another matter is how do you define the distance of harmonic change? That is, in fact, also linked to timbre. For example, harmonic changes by minor thirds or by tritone have a really short harmonic distance based on the spectral structure of harmonic sound. So the dramatic effect of a short distant harmonic change is quite mild to my ears. For example, in structural key points of my compositions, I prefer stronger effects, the ones that require more distant harmonic changes. For example, change by fifth, which is very common in tonal music, is very long distant change because it affects so much in spectral structure of the timbre. In some parts of my compositions where I want a density of musical information to be really high, I often use rapid, mild harmonic changes, such as changes based on minor third relations. And in such passages, I think one do not have such a strong sense of central tone or key as in passages with slow changes. So, for example, if harmony changes by 10-second intervals, then I think it's possible to have a sense of key. But if the change is to a distant harmony, if the change is to a distant harmony, it may sound like I composed it for the maximum effect, but my thinking is different from keys.
Thank you so much for that really compelling response. I'll just go off script for a minute to kind of reflect on even the process of preparing for this interview. I mean, your musical thinking is, and I say this because I think it's evident to anyone once they just sit down and listen to your music, is kind of so on another plane that I struggle to even, put into words the things that I'm noticing about it. And so to hear your, to me, I'm like, how can I even describe the sense of kind of constant harmonic motion in this music? And so I come up with the word key changes, but it's so wonderful to hear what's really behind it. And thank you for also, connecting the dots between harmony and timbres there, because, as you know, I do want to talk to you about timbres a lot. I didn't know, so I really appreciate you bringing that in there. And I should have asked a little bit about your sort of musical background as it connects to your familial background. So thank you for explaining about your parents and your approach to sound being initially sort of like a mathematical fascination, as you say. And I think that I'll go back to sort of my questions in a minute and stop gushing, but I think that your facility with music and your ability to express sort of an emotion, which, as you say, is sort of this non-mathematical thing, but that can be accomplished through math. I think it's so evident because the music is just so saturated with it. So yeah, thank you for all of that context. Let's see. I wonder, generally speaking, just because your music and your musical thinking really, I mean, to me, seems to be pushing boundaries. Do you identify as an avant-gardist? Do such labels even mean anything to you? Are they relevant to you, or what would you say about that?
Actually, I love avant-garde. I read avant-garde books and go to galleries of avant-garde art and listen to avant-garde music, even from the recordings. But as an artist, I think that is not my path, because to me, avant-garde means, in quotes, making audience uncomfortable. So avant-garde sort of questions the art form itself and intentionally breaks the rules and expectations that institutions and audience has. So it is not, so to say, sustainable way for an artist, because when you get accepted as an avant-gardist, it's not avant-garde anymore by definition of the word. So I somehow admire people who are willing to take that challenging, lonely, and wearing path, but it's definitely not for me. So about concept of practical composer, which could be a opposite of avant-garde, that sounds to me like doing a new piece for every Friday, although labels sometimes are used by artists who like to belong in a community, like we neo-romantic composers or we spectral composers. But if you compare it to, for example, to a literature, at least for me, it would be an irrelevant question if, for example, Paul Auster would be a practical author, just because he is not trying to push language into its boundaries. And if you think any of my compositions, they are really far from music made for practical purposes, such as background music. But when it comes then to my identity as a composer, I would much like to be remembered as opera composer, but that is only because I love opera so much myself. And my music has been labeled by others as spectral school and neo-romantic and sometimes also modernistic. And I think it could, for example, help somebody to come to listen a neo-romantic opera rather than modernistic opera. But myself, I wouldn't use such labels.
Yeah, and I think it's always, well, maybe not always, but I think it's so often something that it's just the broader world trying to make sense of an artist's work, that people even find a necessity in applying these labels. But I still find it to be interesting how different artists do or don't relate to them and do or don't embrace them. So that's always very interesting to hear. Let's see. I feel like when I listen to your music, and I'm gonna again speak in very colloquial terms here, and I'm sure that there are more elegant ways to describe this than the way I'm about to. But you have this way of sort of handing off a line or a part from one instrument or one set of instruments to another. To make up an arbitrary example, you know, maybe there'll be a few violins playing a part, and then it'll pass over to, I don't know, a few clarinets, and then back to the violins or something like that. How did you learn to do this? Because to me, it's like it's kind of one of the things that, I mean, again, it's one of these structures that's kind of built up of almost mathematical units, but when you hear it, it sounds, I mean, it's almost like you hear it like you can see an image in your mind or something. I wonder if you can reflect on how you learned to do this and on the role that this feature plays in your music.
Yes, it's actually, I think the whole symphony orchestra has a set of timbres of equal value. And that is not always the case, because, for example, the orchestration handbooks tend to guide composers to think the string sound as the most valuable timbre in orchestra. And some of well-known authors even write about woodwind and brass sound as ear tiring. So, and the string sound is the only one you can listen for hours. And for me, that would be like telling the painters that they should use mainly blue color because yellow is tiring to eyes or something like that. But the orchestra for me should be like a demographic society where basically everyone has at least a possibility to be on charge, not only first violins and strings in general. And the amount of string players in orchestra comes actually from acoustical facts. You need quite many violins playing in unison to match the sound power of a single trumpet. And also, because there are such many strings in orchestra, I think composers should not forget individual string desks either. And for example, in many of my pieces, I have written solos also for last desks of violins and cello. And I actually love to hear different instruments playing beautiful tones, and bouncing melodies from instruments to another will give basically an overdose of such beauty. And I don't think I actually learned it anywhere other than reading the scores of fellow composers.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's one of the things that really wowed me about your music. I wasn't going to ask you about this until later, I should say, but I wonder if it's relevant now. Maybe it's not. I was, skimming through your dissertation and found you talking about a concept called stream formation. Can you describe this phenomenon a little bit and maybe talk about the effect to which you put it in your music, or what other composers have done with it that you find you admire?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, the auditory stream is a concept of music psychology. It basically means that our hearing system tend to group concurrent sounds together so that multiple sounds are perceived as one. That happens, of course, in music too, but the mechanisms that results sounds to form a stream are currently not fully known. It is in fact interesting that in orchestral music, it is nearly impossible to perceive all the musical information there is. However, it's funny that the music with multiple concurrent timbres must be our preference, because otherwise we would rather listen to something else. But our perception of so-called multi-timbral music is maybe not as multi-timbral as the music itself. And there has been some research on how many voices and instruments a human can detect from music only by listening. In other words, without seeing the players. And the results are somewhat surprising, but give an indication that maybe even the musician's auditory perception is not as good as one might think it is. It appears that the complex sound is analyzed in the streams, and we attend primarily to one stream at a time. And this attended stream then stands out perceptually while the rest of the sound is less prominent. And we can, of course, switch attention from one music or conversation to another, or one melodic line to another, and we may have some awareness of other voices, but it appears that one stream at a time is selected for a complete conscious analysis. And therefore, in complex orchestral music, the different timbres blend together in listeners' hearing system, whether the composer wants it or not. And there are several known features of concurrent timbres that affect the stream formation. They are maybe too complex to discuss here, but actually composers have used these features perhaps unconsciously for ages. Let's take Richard Strauss, for example. He takes advantage of stream formation to build so-called super instruments, which means concurrent sounding instruments that are perceived as one. And Strauss definitely did not have slightest clue about stream formation, but exploited it intuitively. So the principle of stream formation is present all the time in my orchestral music, especially when I want to enhance, for example, weak sounding instrument acoustically. And that can be done adding an instrument below the first one in register, following the rules of stream formation so that the perceived timbre is the one from the weak sounding instrument. And with this technique, for example, solo violin can be made audible even to thick orchestration in a violin concerto.
So if I just a quick follow-up, if I'm understanding correctly, you're saying like you'd have the violin solo and then you'd have something playing, let's say an octave below, where the first overtone of that instrument is going to be the fundamental note sounding from the violin?
Yes, basically it's not actually that simple.
Oh, okay.
But, it's about matching the spectrum of the lower instrument so that it doesn't disturb the violin, but actually enhances its sound. So you actually hear the violin, but it has more body.
Wow. So cool. I know that people who are hearing this interview and who aren't familiar with your music are going to check it out, because yeah, this is so amazing. I think this is a good time for me to ask you about this piece of music that it was actually my introduction to you, and I was like, I have to ask you about it today. You know, since I have this opportunity to talk to you. It's your piece On the Crest of Waves. It's an orchestral piece that to me is just like, it's such a huge, epic, almost sort of iconic piece, to me at least. I mean, it's now so much in my listening rotation. You know, I think you were still maybe in your 20s when you wrote this piece of music. I wonder, first of all, sort of, you know, what's the story behind it? Because, you know, it showcases, I think, so many of the compositional talents that we've been talking about. You know, your ability to have interplay between different voices, to create different streams. You know, there are really elegant fugues like all through this thing. We haven't really discussed fugues, but you know, and just really choice use of orchestral percussion at just the right moments and all these amazing elements. So I don't know, I wonder if you could tell me kind of what's going on in this piece and just, I guess, what it means to you.
Yes, in that orchestral piece, I actually took an inspiration from Richard Strauss's orchestral scores. Those scores are very rich, and he varies the timbre quite much in his scores also. And I admire especially Strauss's instrumental doublings. He seems to have an intuitive sense for which timbres blend well together. And in his writings, he even makes distinction between German and French oboe players, claiming that German players' tone has better piercing strength. So my piece On the Crest of Waves can be seen as an artistic research about orchestration. I basically took the abstract concept of Strauss' orchestration style as a starting point and composed my piece taking different views on that concept. But to make it clear, in my piece, there's not any music actually borrowed from Strauss, only the concept. And I also tried to orchestrate in a demographic manner, giving leading moments to as many different instruments I could, even the individual desks of string section. And another idea was to make the orchestra sound as big as possible. And that can be actually achieved by filling the whole spectrum with sound, or in very technical terms, by activating all critical bands in our hearing system by equal energy. And that is very challenging to do with symphonic orchestra, because the general orchestral timbre peaks heavily on spectrum area from 3 to 800 hertz. So, but the help comes from orchestral percussion, especially from bass drum and antique cymbals that fill out the low and high end of the spectrum. And especially for big full-bodied sound, the first critical band, in other words, the frequencies below 100 hertz are extremely important. So I think that is the main timbre of that orchestral piece.
Such an amazing piece of music, and it's as you're describing sort of the elements that caused it to come together in the way that it does, it makes perfect sense, because it's such a rich and powerful and full-bodied listening experience. A simple question. I wonder if there's a primary instrument that you compose on, or sort of how you approach composing in that sense.
Maybe my all-time favorite instrument is French horn, because it has such a big variance in timbre depending on the dynamics. For example, when played softly, the sound is round and mellow, but when played loud, the sound is very piercing and brassy. And in addition, the different registers of the instrument have very distinctive characteristic, because the high pitches need high control on lip stiffness, and the sounding experience of high tones of French horn is much higher than it appears on the score or even in spectrum. So French horn is one of the most expressive instruments in the orchestra, and I've written actually a concerto for French horn, and I'm currently writing my second concerto, which will be premiered in November. And other than French horn, I like basically instruments that are somehow restricted, either by playing register dynamic possibilities or by sound producing mechanism. And I also like instruments that are closely linked to the body of the player. For example, I know that many cellists think their instrument as an extension of their body. And when they play, you can even hear the instrument breathing with the player. So I think the term would be for that would be embodied timbre or something like that. And other times when my composition ideas are more related to harmonic and melodic material than timbre, I choose piano or accordion or any instrument where the sound producing mechanism is uniform throughout the register. And piano, of course, is the instrument nearly all composers have in their studio, but I actually rarely compose for piano.
Amazing, amazing. First of all, and actually I'll have to ask your forgiveness in advance. I'm going to mispronounce the name of this piece. Maybe you can correct me. A piece of music you composed called Laet Laoloi. Laet Laoloi. It's such an incredible piece of music. I mean, it's a piece for flute and kantele. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Kantele is a type of psaltery, which is sort of like a zither, a sort of old school European instrument, one could say. It's just for these two instruments, and you managed to bring so much space, so much depth, such a variety of texture, and so much movement for this piece written for, again, like you said, in such a kind of constricted tonal range, timbral range, just this plucked string instrument and this flute. And I've noticed that in a few other, I mean, your small ensemble work, including that piece, including a piece called Streams, which is arranged for two accordions, that you maintain a lot of the kind of harmonic and timbral intricacies that bring this sense of heightened drama to your large orchestral works. You're able to maintain that even when you're dealing with just like two instruments. How are you able to? I mean, I call it almost like the Pulkkis feeling or the Pulkkis sound. How are you able to take that that sensibility, that sound from these huge orchestral formats to these very intimate chamber settings. And I know that's a lot of questions all in one, so take your time responding.
Yes, first maybe about the piece for kantele and flute. It's called in Finnish "Laet lauloi." Actually, the kantele instrument is quite popular in Finland because it is part of our cultural heritage. It also appears in our national epic. And the instrument do not have any classical romantic repertoire, of course, so players perform mostly contemporary music and arrangements. And the title, Finnish title, comes directly from our national epic called Kalevala, where is an old wise man, Väinämöinen, who plays kantele and there are words with, translated to English are something like the hills sang and rocks trembled. And reading that, I wondered, how can a weak sounding instrument make rocks tremble? And I decided to compose a piece which could have been the one Väinämöinen was playing. And the title, Laet lauloi, can be freely translated to English as hills sang. So then about the weak sound of the instruments, kantele, as I said earlier, the restrictions of the instruments inspire me. And I think the mood for the piece comes from the effort musicians make trying to play something that is not so idiomatic for the instrument. For example, in the piece I wrote musical texture where the same material is played by both musicians but at different speed. For example, kantele plays melody in 8 notes, but the flute plays it in quintuplets. So the pitch structures is in the piece such that the melody creates also the harmony. So the results of them playing together is closer to timbre than a heard melody. So I think that it's the two instruments that practically blend in together. And about this Pulkkis sound you mentioned, it is of course completely different task to write chamber music than to write orchestral music. And I think my compositional ideas are more harmony and melody related when I compose for small ensemble or a soloist. But I do not think that I have some abstract sound that I transfer to different formats. Actually, when I start a new composition, I find out what the specific set of instruments has to offer and then advance from there. And the possible resemblance of my chamber music to my orchestral music is intentional.
Cool. Yeah, it's some of these things that seem pop up in the minds of listeners or in the awareness of listeners. It's interesting how to a composer, to a player, it doesn't even occur at all. Let's see, I was reading an interview that you gave where you're talking about your latest opera, All the Truths We Cannot See. And by the way, we'll talk in more depth about your opera work in a little bit. But in this interview, you said something that I found really interesting. You said that sometimes essentially you allow music to kind of circulate or maybe percolate in your head for sometimes months before you actually take pen to paper, so to speak, and start copying down any notes. Could you say a little bit more about this aspect of your compositional process?
Yes, actually, especially with vocal music, I tend to develop music in my head even long time before writing it down, because I feel that as long as I don't write it down, everything is possible. and writing it down makes it somehow fixed. And after that, I have a higher threshold to alter it. So actually, I get best compositional ideas while running. My hobby, by the way, is marathon running, and so I run really a lot.
Wow,
so
that's serious. Wow, congratulations.
Thanks. And one training can take over 2 hours, so there's plenty of time to do thinking. So before the compositional ideas have been written down, so they don't have to me any measurable properties such as pitch or duration or tempo, articulation, or at least I don't bind any of these properties to them. So after finally I write the idea down, though these properties must be set, mainly because of our Western notation system. So I've noticed that in written down form, I tend to concentrate on details, not the abstraction. So after I have some score ready, so that preparation takes really long time for me. For example, 20 minutes orchestral work over half a year. And with orchestral piece, I polish the orchestration quite much, thinking about timbres and trying different doublings and analyzing them with computer. And I think the usual problem for composer is that we'd like to control the piece as much as possible, leaving very little to musicians' interpretation. So I have actively tried to avoid that and try not to over-notate the score. And that is indeed a difficult task to find the balance between instructions and freedom in the score. Many of my conductor friends have pointed out that, for example, Brahms is one of the most efficient composers in that sense. And in the case of opera, all the truths we cannot see, and in my opera compositions in general, I send the parts to singers in very early stages so that they can comment if there's something awkward, especially for their voice. And this kind of communication is very sensitive because actually very few musicians are ready to openly admit that something is difficult for them. So that is why I try to establish also some kind of friendship with the soloists of upcoming opera so they feel comfortable to talk about their voice. And earlier I talked about how musicians' body is linked to their instrument. And in the case of a singer, the body is their instrument. And even the slightest stress can be heard in their performance. So that's why I like my vocal parts to be tailored just for each singer's strengths, so that they can concentrate on drama and acting and not the mechanical realization of the score. So in other words, my compositional process is very slow and partly invisible to the outside world. And by that, I mean the stage developing the ideas in my head.
That's amazing. Yeah, wow. It's really interesting to hear how that works. And actually, I'm going to skip down because you basically half answered a question that I had. So I want to ask it now before it gets stale. I noticed that I was on this website, Music Finland, and I was checking out some of your sort of musical CV, so to speak. I noticed your cello concerto Dragonfly seemed to be written for the cellist Ella Venpoka. Who's also, you can find a video on YouTube of her performing this piece, totally riveting performance. You just mentioned that with your operas, not only are you writing with a specific singer in mind, but it's maybe even sort of a dialogical process somehow, composing, between you and the singer. In instrumental music, do you often also write with a particular soloist in mind?
Actually, nearly every concerto, solo, and vocal piece of mine is written for a particular soloist. And in fact, many of my pieces utilize special talents of musicians. For example, in my horn concerto, there are pitches that are fifth lower than horn's register, just because the player I had a special talent producing them. And in my song cycle for soprano and orchestra, the soloist sings pitches a fifth over high C of the normal soprano. And those passages are not just gimmicks, but the extreme pitches are also part of the drama of the music. And there actually have been interesting situations when other musicians have performed these pieces because they simply need to find a way to produce those needed pitches. And for operas, as I said, I try to have as good communication as possible. And I think nowadays it's maybe rare to have it other way around, composing an opera without even meeting the soloists.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's like you said. I mean, something you can get deeper results when you have a personal relationship with the players. It's really cool. I want to ask you one more question, sort of about your general life as a composer, and then we'll move on to talking about Score Tool, which is the piece of the compositional aid software that you developed. That's very interesting. You seem to have established quite a distinctive voice as a composer at a relatively young age. Would you mind summing up the musical diet that you were on while that voice was developing?
I think each composer's voice is a sum of influences they have. And in my youth, I listened to Tchaikovsky, Wagner, Boulez, and Grisey. And the last name is maybe unknown to you. Gerard Grisey is a French spectral composer.
Oh,
so yeah. When I think of my pieces I wrote in my 20s, like my violin concerto, Enchanted Garden, the style of that piece is in fact a mixture of the style of composers I just mentioned. So, and maybe the other thing that might have affected was that because of my family background, growing up with computers, I was quite fluent with computer algorithms and digital world in general at a time when it was maybe not so common among my colleagues.
Cool. Thank you so much. So now shifting to talk about the Score Tool. First of all, because I didn't really do much of an introduction around it, and I don't know if I'm really qualified to. For the benefit of our listeners who haven't gotten to check it out, could you give us sort of the elevator pitch explanation of what this program is and what it does?
Yeah, actually I did it firstly for my own purposes, because the initial idea for the Score Tool came from my experience I gained from the orchestral rehearsals of my compositions, and that is an inaudible solo instrument. For example, in the rehearsals of my accordion concerto, there were numerous passages where the sound of accordion was masked by the double bass playing 2 octaves below in register. And I have also encountered problems in orchestral balance in my operas, where the voice of a solo singer has been unexpectedly drowned even in low dynamic orchestration. And in these examples, the inaudibility of soloists could not have been predicted from the score. And in rehearsals, when the time is very short, the solution would usually be bring down the other instruments than the soloist and ask the soloist to play louder. And many times this is not the optimal solution that anybody wants, because the balance between instruments may be well taught by composer, and changes destroy that balance. And the Score Tool gives possibility to pre-evaluate orchestral passages so that these kind of inaudibility situations can be avoided. And score tool also tells which instruments in the orchestration are causing the trouble. For example, I have checked with my own app that Brahms' violin concerto, there are passages where the solo violin is mainly masked by French horn, but conductors usually bring down the whole orchestra when it would be enough just taking down French horn. And in addition to audibility issues, score tool give analytical information about the timbre. For example, about the homogeneity and the formant structure of the orchestration. And this analytical information can be used, for example, to compare the properties of different timbres, which is quite difficult task to do otherwise. And there is also a search option in the program where you can set the rules of which kind of timbre you are looking for, and the program gives you a suggestion for an orchestration.
So cool. Well, okay, I've got a couple follow-up questions. I'm going to ask them kind of out of order. Because the thing that you just said, I mean, so how does it, I guess it's just based on the spectral properties it delivers. Because what my question was going to be was there was I think it was written either in the specs or in your dissertation or something that, yeah, this program can help you arrive at a decision to score a piece using a set of instruments that you hadn't thought of on your own. So I wonder if you can just expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, actually, you can input there what instruments you have, and then let the program tell which parts of the register have the timbral quality you want. So it's kind of putting the orchestration to psychoacoustic algorithms and let the computer mimic human hearing system. So that is basically the idea behind it.
That is so cool. So that's not very professional, but I'm just like, I'm so blown away by this thing, and just messing around with it the little bit that I got to do was really exciting. So yeah, something else that you said in your first answer on the score tool. So do I understand correctly that let's say if I upload an entire score, the program will come back and be like, okay, these are the places where you might run into significant masking issues affecting kind of the lead voice or the solo voice. And it basically it can, in an automated way, flag that a human being listening to this is going to run into issues or something?
Yeah, that is maybe exactly what the program does. You can feed the entire score in the program. The only drawback currently is that the algorithm is quite slow. So, for example, calculating the masking graph for a 10-minute long orchestral piece could take over an hour. I actually haven't found a good solution that yet, but maybe that's just the price you must pay for the information. And the other thing one must keep in mind using the program is that the results are sadly only directional. That is mostly because it is very difficult to give numerical values to dynamical markings in the score. For example, the variance of mezzo forte can be over 10 decibels of sound pressure depending on the player. So the program flags the places where problems might appear. So the directionality causes mainly so-called false positives. So in other words, if the program shows no audibility issues, the soloist can most likely to be heard in the rehearsals.
Interesting. So it gives you sort of a margin of error reading that it's possible you could run into an issue here, depending on if the soloist is playing a little quieter and the accompanist is playing a little louder.
Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. A multi-part question, because now the word psychoacoustics has come up a couple times in this interview. In relation to, so first of all, you mentioned that the score tool, gives insight into certain kinds of psychoacoustic phenomena. Would you explain how it does this, but also kind of couch that in a broader explanation of psychoacoustics? Because I know that, a lot of us have encountered this word in the context of a pretty influential book called On the Sensation of Tone, which was by Hermann Helmholtz, the 19th century scientist. But I and probably others haven't really gone back and deeply developed our understanding of this concept since that kind of early encounter with Helmholtz. So I'd be grateful, if you could give a brief review of, sort of the current state of our knowledge about psychoacoustics in general, and then also talk about the importance of this phenomenon in your work.
Yes, psychoacoustic is basically about how the sound is perceived in our hearing system. Usually when, for example, the sound spectrum is analyzed by a computer, the result is a detailed graph which shows the physical properties of the sound waves. But that is actually quite different from the way our hearing system works. So for example, auditory masking is one result of psychoacoustics because the sound waves of inaudible sound are not physically masked. They are not just not perceivable by our hearing system. And actually in the turn of the millennium, the auditory masking was quite popular field of research because psychoacoustic models were used widely in audio coding. And one model particularly was particularly popular, which is commonly known as MP3. And in MP3 coded music, the psychoacoustic model is used to hide so-called quantization noise under the masking threshold which music creates. So the model works quite well because very few people complain about hearing noise in MP3 coded music. And in score tool, I have used mostly the psychoacoustic model of MP3 coding as a basis to calculate the masking curve. And I have made little changes to the algorithm to support my needs. And there are currently also other psychoacoustic models available, which takes, for example, binaural hearing into account, but their formulas are even slower to calculate than formulas of MP3 model. And I think nowadays psychoacoustic models for, at least for audio coding, are not so much researched because the size of music file is not more an issue because of the high-speed internet.
Got it. Very interesting. Well, so I want to move on and ask you about your operas, but do you want to do sort of, just before we do that, let people know if they want to play around with this software, where they can find it, and any little kind of promotional speech you want to give?
Yeah, actually the full program can be used online at score-tool.com. And mobile version is on Apple App Store with the name Score Tool Timbre Explorer. And the source code is also freely downloadable on github.com.
Excellent. Yeah, I know some people are gonna want to mess with that thing. So yeah, moving on to opera. And correct me if, by the way, if anything I'm saying is wrong here, because it's not been the easiest part of the research to do. But I read somewhere that you've already composed 5 operas, which, first of all, that's amazing. A single opera, I understand, is just an incredible amount of work. So I want to ask you a few questions about this. To begin with, quite simply, can you describe the process of working with a librettist rather than, normally one thinks of a composer working alone? And then, is opera composing in general very different of an experience from writing instrumental pieces for orchestra?
Yes, first about opera as an art, I actually find opera the most impressive form of art there is. There is no other way for expressing such a deep emotions than opera. And for me, even the films come in second. And the beauty of opera for an artist is that it's a collaborative work. The librettist, composer, stage director, soloist, orchestra, and the conductor all work for same purpose. And very few times somebody of the chain have totally different view of the work than others. And even if somebody has, that only makes an interesting discussion. And the librettists I've had, they usually send me first version, it's usually all too long to be composed as an opera, because singing the text takes so much more time than reading it aloud. And a good way to reduce the text is a concept invented by Verdi in 19th century. It's called the schemic word. That means finding a single word or phrase which kind of sums up the current state of the drama on stage. And after telling this to the librettist, we usually sit down and find these schemic words to each scene of the opera. And usually that helps the librettist to realize that what can be cut from the text without altering the initial idea. And also, after I start to compose music, I usually ask a bit more text here and there, or ask if I can cut something that does not fit into my music. And during the composition phase, I may also realize that some character need an aria to explain their actions, and usually librettists agree on all of this. And also for me, it's important to give each character of the opera a proper exit. That is a scene which explains that the character is no more seen on stage. And too often, even in popular operas, the characters just disappear without a notice. And that is usually a thing to discuss with the librettist.
It's I mean, it's really, yeah, it's such a dense art form. It's hard to imagine how much work and kind of planning and all that must go into the creation of one of these things. As I was researching you online, I found I think this was on the Music Finland site. I found about 65 or 70 or so of your compositions, which ranged from, by the date of their composition, ranged from the mid 90s to the late 2010s. And reading through this list, I realized that most of your pieces that I've heard recordings of, which is all just, on what I can find on the internet, basically, were written mostly in the early and mid 2000s. This may be, again, because they've come out on CD, or because, people, recorded them and put them up to YouTube. And maybe it's just that the more recent stuff is still in the pipeline. But having not really had a chance to hear, your very recent music too much, I'm wondering, first of all, has your sound evolved as you've been moving pretty resolutely towards being an opera composer? Or not towards, but I mean, as you're now established as an opera composer, if it has changed, in what ways? And also, when will your fans, let's say outside of Northern Europe, have easy access to listen to your more recent works? And also, just a general question: do your compositions sometimes not get performed, not get recorded?
All of my pieces, luckily, are performed, but not necessarily recorded. For example, in last years, I have concentrated quite much in opera, and they are really not easy to get recorded because the ensemble is usually so large. So there has been plans which progress slowly, but hopefully someday you can find my operas also on CD. Also, there are nowadays such a large amount of channels where music is published. And for example, my 1 hour long symphony for celebrating Finland's 100th Independence Day was recorded as a video and showed for 2 years from 2018 to 2019 on international flights on Finnish aviation company Finnair. And about my style, in my own view, my music has evolved to be maybe more accessible than in 10 years ago. And I think I have learned to focus on the ideas that I really find interesting and learn to orchestrate music more efficiently than before.
Cool. I can't wait to hear it. I want to ask you if you'd mind telling us a little bit about your latest opera, All the Truths We Cannot See. And I understand that you wrote it with the aid of score tools. So if you can also talk about what that was like.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe just mention that the opera All the Truths We Cannot See is an opera about Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which occurred when I was just 11 years old. And for Finnish kids, it was really a generation experience because we were afraid of the fallout, which luckily was smaller than expected. And the librettist of the opera is Glenda Goss, who is an American author who has also been living in Finland. And I wrote the opera as a part of my doctoral project for Sibelius Academy of Music, and partly to show and explain how the score tool program can be used in composition work. And in my opera composition, I've used a score tool to find the most effective timbres for the purpose of drama, and also to ensure that every singer can be heard through orchestration.
Excellent, excellent. And I understand that there's a Los Angeles connection somehow with this opera, All the Truths We Cannot See.
Yes, the Los Angeles University USC Thornton is a co-producer of my opera with the Sibelius Academy Opera Department. And there are student singers coming to sing in the production from both schools. And the work will be performed both in Helsinki and Los Angeles with current plans in spring 2022. And I have tailored the parts especially for the student singers. And it has been fascinating to notice that the students both in LA and in Helsinki are very high quality artists and have not only superb vocal material, but also a good sense of phrasing and drama. And I'm sure many of these students will make an outstanding career, and I can be proud that they are singing my music.
Amazing. It's great. And I noticed that this is just an aside remark, but I noticed that a lot of your music is written for younger soloists who are clearly kind of the greats of tomorrow. I think that's such a cool thing that you do to kind of build those connections with them early in their careers. A final question that I had prepared, at least. Opera seems to be enjoying something of a renaissance at the moment. There are a body of works being created that in some respects resemble the operas of old, and in other ways are really kind of new and revolutionary forms of expression. This may be sort of a daft question to ask an opera composer, But do you have any thoughts on the future of opera, so to speak, or at least thoughts on the current state of the art form?
As I said earlier, that for me the opera is the most effective form of art, at least at emotional level. And there is something magical in the combination of visual drama, music, and singing. And the opera art form was actually intentionally developed some 400 years ago to be the most impressive form of art there is. And I think it still is holding the crown. And from my point of view, there is actually no need for fundamental changes in the concept of opera. It is much like with novels or theater plays. Many have tried to drastically change the concept and even the language, but the new ideas have not replaced the traditional concept of written novel or theater play yet. And also in opera too, the content, music, and drama are the most important parameters. And what would I like to see in opera that is not currently there? It's maybe more visual experiments on stage, because nowadays the video projection technology makes stage changes very quick and gives possibility to build unbelievable realistic scenery. So this is of course question of resources, but I think the technology is cheap. It is maybe a matter of enthusiastic visual artists to really concentrate themselves on opera.
Very interesting response. And I'd like to close with a question that I hadn't really been planning to ask you, but I won't ask you what your favorite opera is, but are there any operas that that you feel very just inspired by, or that move you a lot?
Maybe in general, all operas of Richard Strauss, but one which is perfect in sense of drama, story, and everything is Tosca by Puccini. Yeah.
Cool, cool. Well, Uljas Pulkkis, thank you so much for making the time to talk to me. It's a real privilege to hear about your compositional process and your relationship to music. It's really fascinating.
Thank you so much for having me.